Sometimes the people nobody believes in become the ones nobody can ignore. This is the story of a young woman who walked into a world built to break her, carrying nothing but a secret she could not speak and a fire that refused to die. They laughed at her. They pushed her down. They told her she did not belong. But what she carried inside her was stronger than anything they had ever seen. And the day she finally revealed it, everything changed. Not just for her, but for every single person who had ever doubted her. Maria Vasquez grew up in a small, dusty town on the border of Texas and Mexico. The kind of town where everybody knew everybody and nobody ever really left. The houses were old. The roads were cracked. And the dreams of the people who lived there were usually as dry as the land around them. But Maria was different. She had always been different. Even as a little girl, she would stand at the edge of the town and look out toward the horizon like she was waiting for something. Her mother used to say that Maria had old eyes. Eyes that had seen things before she was even born. Eyes that carried weight. Her father had been a soldier, not a famous one, not a decorated one. Just a man who believed in duty and service and doing the right thing even when the right thing was the hardest thing. He had served in the army for 12 years before a roadside explosion in Afghanistan took his legs and eventually took his life. Maria was 9 years old when they buried him. She stood at his grave in a black dress that was too big for her, and she did not cry, not because she was not sad. She was the saddest person in that cemetery. But because her father had once told her something, she never forgot. He said that tears were for the moments when you had given up, and Maria had not given up on anything. Not yet. Not ever. After her father died, life became harder in ways that most people could not imagine. Her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, one at a laundromat during the day, and another cleaning offices at night. Maria would come home from school to an empty house, and she would cook dinner for her younger brother Diego, who was only 5. She would help him with his homework even though she was still learning herself. She would tuck him into bed and tell him stories about their father, stories about bravery and strength and never giving up. And then she would sit alone in the kitchen and she would study. Not because she loved school, but because she had made a promise to herself. A promise that one day she would wear the same uniform her father wore. A promise that she would finish what he started. By the time Maria was 17, she had become one of the best students in her school. Not because she was naturally gifted. She struggled with math. She struggled with science. But she worked harder than anyone else. While other kids were going to parties and hanging out at the mall, Maria was running 5 miles every morning before the sun came up. She was doing push-ups in her bedroom at night. She was reading military history books from the public library. She was preparing herself for something that most people in her town thought was crazy. A girl from their little border town joining the army. People talked about it like it was a joke. Even her own relatives would shake their heads and say things like, she should find a nice man and settle down. But Maria did not listen to any of them. She had a mission, and nothing was going to stop her. On the day she turned 18, Maria walked into the army recruiting office in the nearest city. The recruiter was a large man with a thick neck and a crew cut, who looked at her like she had walked into the wrong building. He asked her if she was looking for directions. She told him she was looking for an enlistment form. He raised his eyebrows and slid the paperwork across the desk without saying a word. Maria filled out every line carefully. When she handed it back, the recruiter looked it over and then looked at her again. He asked her if she understood what she was signing up for. She told him she understood better than most. He did not ask what she meant by that. Maybe he should have. Basic training started on a cold January morning at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. Maria had never been so far from home. She had never seen snow before. She had never been in a room with so many strangers. There were 42 recruits in her platoon, and only 8 of them were women. The men looked at the women like they were obstacles, like they were there to slow things down, and the drill sergeants did nothing to change that attitude. If anything, they made it worse. From the very first day, it was clear that the women would have to work twice as hard to earn half the respect. The head drill sergeant was a man named Sergeant First Class Dale Rowan. He was tall and lean with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He had been in the army for 20 years and he had served 3 tours overseas. He was tough. He was loud. He was relentless. And he had very little patience for excuses. Sergeant Rowan believed that the army was a place for warriors, and warriors did not complain. They did not make excuses. They did not show weakness. And in his experience, most of the recruits who washed out were the ones who could not handle the pressure, the ones who cried, the ones who quit, the ones who were not built for this life. Maria caught his attention on the very first day, not because she stood out, but because she did not. She was small. She was quiet. She stood at the back of the formation, and she kept her eyes forward and her mouth shut. When Sergeant Rowan walked down the line inspecting the recruits, he stopped in front of her and looked down. He asked her name. She'd told him. He asked her where she was from. She told him. He asked her why she had joined the army. She said because her father was a soldier. Sergeant Rowan stared at her for a long moment and then moved on without saying another word. The first weeks of basic training were brutal. They woke up at 4:30 every morning to the sound of Sergeant Rowan banging on the barracks door and screaming at them to get up. They had 5 minutes to get dressed and get outside. Then they ran. They ran until their legs burned and their lungs screamed, and some of them threw up on the side of the road. Then they did push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, jumping jacks, mountain climbers. Every exercise designed to break them down physically and mentally. And then they did it all again after breakfast. Maria struggled. She would not pretend otherwise. She was smaller than most of the other recruits. She weighed 120 pounds, soaking wet. Her arms were thin. Her legs were strong from all the running she had done back home. But the upper body exercises nearly destroyed her. On the third day, she failed the pull-up bar. She hung there with her arms shaking and her face red, and she could not pull herself up even one more time. Some of the male recruits laughed. Not loudly. Just quiet snickers that they thought she could not hear. But she heard them. She heard every single one. Sergeant Rowan saw it too. He walked over to where she was hanging from the bar, and he looked up at her with those cold stone eyes. He told her to get down. She dropped to the ground and stood at attention. He asked her if she had a problem. She said, "No, Sergeant." He asked her if she thought she could keep up with the rest of the platoon. She said, "Yes, Sergeant." He leaned in close enough that she could feel his breath on her face, and he said that he had seen a lot of recruits come through here with big dreams and small abilities. He said that wanting to be a soldier and being a soldier were two very different things. And then he walked away. That night, Maria lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Her body ached in places she did not know could ache. Her hands were raw and blistered from the pull-up bar. Her shoulders felt like they had been pulled from their sockets. Around her, the other recruits were already asleep, their breathing slow and steady in the dark barracks. But Maria could not sleep. She kept hearing the laughter. She kept seeing Sergeant Rowan's face. She kept feeling the weight of all those doubts pressing down on her chest like a stone. But underneath all of that pain and doubt and exhaustion, there was something else. Something small and hot and stubborn that burned in the center of her chest like a coal that refused to go out. It was the same feeling she had when she stood at her father's grave, the same feeling she had when she ran those 5 miles every morning in the dark. It was not hope. It was not courage. It was something deeper than both. It was a refusal to be defeated. The next morning, Maria was the first one awake. She got up 15 minutes before the alarm, and she went outside into the freezing darkness, and she started doing pull-ups on the bar in the training yard. Her arms screamed. Her muscles trembled. She could barely manage 2, but she did 2. And then she rested, and she did 2 more. And then she rested, and she did 1 more. 5 pull-ups in the cold, dark morning while everyone else was sleeping. It was not much, but it was a start. She did this every single morning for the next 2 weeks. While the other recruits slept, she was outside in the dark working on her weakness. Some mornings it was so cold her fingers stuck to the metal bar and she had to peel them off, leaving skin behind. Some mornings she was so tired she could barely lift her arms, but she never missed a morning. Not one. And slowly, gradually, her numbers started to go up. 3 pull-ups, then 5, then 10. By the end of the second week, she could do 12 pull-ups without stopping. It was still not the best in the platoon, but it was enough to keep up. But keeping up was not enough to stop the problems. There was a group of male recruits who had decided early on that the women in the platoon did not belong. The leader of this group was a thick-necked recruit named Kyle Braddock, from somewhere in Georgia. Braddock was big and strong and loud, and he had played football in high school, and he believed that the military was a man's world. He never said this directly to the drill sergeants. He was smart enough to keep his mouth shut around authority, but in the barracks and in the mess hall and on the training field when no one was watching, He made sure the women knew exactly how he felt about them. Maria became his favorite target, maybe because she was the smallest, maybe because she was the quietest, maybe because she never fought back. Whatever the reason, Braddock made her life miserable. He would bump into her in the chow line and knock her tray out of her hands. He would make comments under his breath when she was doing exercises. He would call her names that she pretended not to hear. And when she did well on something, he would say it was because the standards were lower for women, that she was being given special treatment, that she had not really earned anything. Maria never reported him. She never complained. She never even acknowledged what he was doing. She just kept her head down and kept working. Some of the other women told her she should say something, that she should go to Sergeant Rowan. But Maria knew that going to authority would only make things worse. It would confirm what Braddock and the others already believed, that women were weak, that they needed protection, that they could not handle the real army. So she stayed quiet, and she took it, and she channeled every insult and every shove and every moment of humiliation into fuel for the fire that burned inside her. There was another reason Maria stayed quiet, a reason she had not told anyone, a reason she carried with her every single day like a weight strapped to her back, something that made her training twice as hard and her struggle twice as real, something that if anyone found out would change everything, not just for her career, but for her entire life. And she was terrified. Not of the training, not of Braddock, not of Sergeant Rowan. She was terrified of the truth, because the truth was something she could not control, and in the army, the thing they taught you first was that control was everything. As the weeks went by, Maria began to notice changes in her body. Small things at first. Dizzy spells during morning runs, a heaviness in her stomach that would not go away, nausea that hit her at random times during the day. She told herself it was the stress, the lack of sleep, the physical demands. She told herself it was normal, that everyone felt this way during basic training. But deep down she knew. She had known for weeks, maybe even before she arrived at Fort Leonard Wood. She had just refused to accept it because accepting it meant that everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, everything she had promised herself and her dead father could be taken away in an instant. Maria Vasquez was pregnant. She had found out 2 weeks before she shipped out to basic training. A drugstore test in the bathroom of her mother's house. 2 pink lines that changed the entire direction of her life. The father was a boy from her town, a boy she had dated for 6 months before he left for college in California, and never called her again. She had thought about telling her mother. She had thought about not going to basic training. She had thought about 100 different options, and none of them felt right. And in the end, she made the hardest decision of her life. She decided to go anyway. She decided to prove that she could do this. That being pregnant did not make her weak. That carrying a child and carrying a weapon were not things that could not exist in the same person. It was a dangerous decision. She knew that. The physical demands of basic training were extreme. The running, the lifting, the crawling through mud and climbing over walls. All of it could put her baby at risk. But Maria believed in herself. She believed in her body. And most of all, she believed that if she gave up now, if she went home with her head down, she would never find the strength to come back. This was her one chance, her one window, and she was going to take it, even if it meant risking everything. So she hid it. She wore her uniform loose. She ate when no one was watching. She dealt with the morning sickness by waking up even earlier and getting it out of her system before anyone else was awake. She drank water constantly to keep herself hydrated. She modified exercises when the drill sergeants were not looking, protecting her midsection as much as she could without being obvious. It was exhausting, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Every single day was a performance. Every single moment was a lie, and the weight of that lie was heavier than any rucksack she carried on her back. The hardest part was the fear, the constant, unrelenting fear that someone would find out, that she would have a complication, that something would happen to the baby. At night, she would lie in her bunk with her hands on her stomach, and she would whisper to the tiny life growing inside her. She would tell it that she was sorry, that she was doing this for both of them, that one day the child would understand why its mother chose the hardest path instead of the easiest one. And sometimes in those dark, quiet moments, she would feel a flutter, a tiny movement like butterfly wings against her palm, and she would close her eyes and she would know that she was not alone. that she was never alone, that the two of them were in this together. But the secret was getting harder to keep. Her body was changing faster now. The fatigue was worse. The nausea was worse. The dizziness came more often and lasted longer, and Sergeant Rowan was watching her. She could feel his eyes on her during training, cold and calculating and missing nothing. He had noticed something. She did not know what exactly, but she could tell by the way he looked at her that he knew something was off, and it was only a matter of time before he figured out what it was. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon during the 6th week of training. They were doing an obstacle course, a brutal series of walls and ropes and mud pits and barbed wire crawls that stretched across half a mile of rough terrain. Maria was doing well. She had made it through the first 3 obstacles without a problem. But when she reached the wall climb, something happened. She grabbed the rope and started pulling herself up, and halfway to the top, a wave of dizziness hit her so hard that the world spun. She lost her grip. She fell, not far, maybe 6 feet, but she landed on her side, and the impact knocked the wind out of her, and for one terrible moment she could not breathe, and she could not move, and all she could think about was the baby. Sergeant Rowan was there in seconds. He stood over her and looked down, and his face showed nothing, no concern, no sympathy, just that same stone expression he always wore. He told her to get up. She tried. Her side was screaming and her head was spinning, but she got to her knees and then to her feet. He asked her what happened. She said she lost her grip. He asked her why. She said she did not know. He stared at her for a long time, and then he said the words that everyone in the platoon could hear. He said that if she could not handle a simple wall climb, then maybe she did not belong here. He said that excuses were for civilians. He said that every time she fell or failed or could not keep up, she was proving that the people who said women did not belong in the army were right. And then he turned his back on her and walked away. Maria stood there in the mud, with her side aching and her head pounding, and 34 pairs of eyes watching her. She could hear Braddock laughing somewhere behind her. She could feel the judgment of every single person on that field pressing against her like a physical force. And in that moment she wanted to quit. For the first time since she arrived, she wanted to walk away and go home and forget all of it. The army, the training, the promise, all of it. But then she felt it, that flutter, that tiny butterfly wing movement inside her. And she remembered why she was here. She remembered who she was doing this for, not just for herself, not just for her father, but for the small life growing inside her that deserved a mother who never gave up, a mother who was strong enough to face the impossible and keep going. Maria wiped the mud from her face. She walked back to the wall. She grabbed the rope and she climbed. After the fall on the obstacle course, something shifted inside Maria. Not the baby, something else. A kind of hardness that settled into her bones like iron being forged in fire. The fall should have broken her. The words from Sergeant Rowan should have crushed whatever was left. But instead they did the opposite. They woke something up inside her that had been sleeping. Something inherited from her father. Something ancient and unbreakable that ran through her blood like a river that could not be dammed. The next morning she was up before anyone else. Her side was bruised purple and yellow from the fall. It hurt to breathe. It hurt to move. But she was outside in the dark doing her pull-ups like she always did, 12 of them now without stopping. Then she dropped down and did push-ups until her arms gave out. Then she ran a mile around the training yard in the freezing pre-dawn air with her breath coming out in white clouds. And when the alarm sounded and the other recruits stumbled outside half asleep, Maria was already standing in formation, straight back. Eyes forward, mud still under her fingernails from the day before. Sergeant Rowan noticed. He always noticed. He walked past her during inspection, and he paused for just a second. Their eyes met, and for the first time since training began, his expression changed. Just barely. Just a flicker of something crossing his stone face like a shadow. It might have been surprise. It might have been respect. Maria could not tell. And then it was gone, and he moved on, and the day began like every other day. But things were getting harder. Not just the training, the pregnancy. Maria was now somewhere around 14 weeks. She had lost count of the exact days because time in basic training did not move like normal time. It stretched and compressed in ways that made weeks feel like months and months feel like minutes. Her body was changing in ways she could no longer easily hide. Her uniform was tighter around the middle. Her breasts were sore and swollen. The morning sickness had faded, but it had been replaced by something worse, a bone-deep exhaustion that settled over her like a heavy blanket every afternoon. The kind of tiredness that no amount of sleep could fix, the kind that came from her body working double time to build a new life, while simultaneously being pushed to its physical limits. She had started making small adjustments that she hoped nobody would notice. During sit-up drills, she would modify her form slightly to reduce pressure on her abdomen. During the crawling exercises, she would shift her weight to her arms and legs to keep her stomach off the ground. When they did the bear crawl, she would raise her hips higher than necessary. Small things, careful things, things that looked like poor form to anyone watching, but were actually calculated decisions to protect the baby growing inside her. Some of the other women in the platoon had started to notice that something was different about Maria. A recruit named Tanya Wilkins, who bunked next to her, had commented one morning that Maria looked different, somehow. Maria had brushed it off and said it was the mess hall food. Tanya had laughed and let it go. But Maria could see the question in her eyes, the quiet suspicion that something was not quite right. The 7th week of training brought a new challenge: weapons qualification. They had spent the previous weeks learning how to handle, clean, and assemble their M4 rifles. Now it was time to prove they could shoot. The qualification range was a flat open field with targets set at distances from 50 to 300 meters. Each recruit had to hit a minimum number of targets to pass. Failure meant repeating the qualification. Repeated failure meant being recycled to a new training platoon. And being recycled was the beginning of the end for most recruits. Maria had never fired a gun before joining the army. Her father had owned one, a small handgun that he kept in a lockbox in the bedroom closet. But he had never taken her shooting. He had told her that guns were tools and that tools required respect and training before they could be used properly. So when Maria stepped up to the firing line, for the first time she had nothing but the basic instruction she had received during training. What happened next surprised everyone, including Sergeant Rowan. Maria was a natural. There was no other way to describe it. From the moment she settled into position behind her rifle and looked through the sights, everything else disappeared. The noise, the cold, the pain in her side, the exhaustion, the fear. All of it faded away, and all that remained was the target and the trigger and the steady rhythm of her breathing. She squeezed the trigger the way they had taught her, slow and deliberate, and the target fell. She adjusted, squeezed again. Another target fell, then another, and another. 23 out of 40 targets on her first qualification attempt. Not just passing, not just good. Outstanding. The range instructor, a stocky sergeant named Williams, walked over to her position and looked at her scorecard and then looked at her. He asked her if she had shot before. She said no. He looked at her scorecard again, shook his head, and said that some people were just born with the gift. Then he walked away, writing something on his clipboard. Sergeant Rowan was standing at the back of the range watching. Maria could feel his eyes on her even though she did not turn around to look. She could feel the weight of his attention like sunlight on the back of her neck, warm and heavy and impossible to ignore. She wondered what he was thinking. She wondered if this changed anything. If being good at something, really truly good at something, could erase all the time she had fallen short in other areas. The answer came later that day. After dinner, Sergeant Rowan called a platoon meeting in the barracks. This was unusual. Platoon meetings happened in the morning during formation, not at night after chow. The recruits assembled quickly, standing at the foot of their bunks in their physical training uniforms. Sergeant Rowan walked in and stood at the center of the room, and he did something he had never done before. He gave a compliment. He said that the platoon's performance on the weapons qualification had been the best he had seen in his 6 years of training recruits. He said that several individuals had scored exceptionally well, and then he said Maria's name. He said that Recruit Vasquez had scored the highest in the platoon on her first attempt, higher than any of the men, higher than any recruit he had trained in the past 2 cycles. He said that she had demonstrated exactly the kind of focus and discipline that the army needed. The barracks went silent. Maria stood at the foot of her bunk and stared straight ahead, and she could feel every eye in the room on her. She could feel Braddock's stare like a knife in her ribs. She could feel the surprise and confusion radiating off the other recruits like heat. And deep inside her, in the place where the baby lived, she felt that flutter again, like the child was celebrating with her. But Braddock could not let it go. Later that night, after lights out, Maria heard him talking to the other men in his section of the barracks. He was not whispering. He wanted her to hear. He said that shooting was not real soldiering, that anyone could lie in the dirt and pull a trigger. He said that real soldiers carried rucksacks and climbed walls and ran for miles, and that Vasquez could barely do any of those things. He said that one good day on the range did not change the fact that she was the weakest link in the platoon, and that sooner or later she would wash out. It was just a matter of time. Maria lay in the dark and listened, and she did not react. She had learned a long time ago that reacting to people like Braddock gave them power, and she was not in the business of giving away power. She needed every ounce of it for herself and for the baby, and for the mission she had set out to complete. The 8th week brought the most physically demanding challenge of basic training, the 12-mile ruck march. Each recruit had to carry a 35-pound rucksack, plus their weapon and equipment, over 12 miles of rough terrain in under 3 hours. It was the final physical test before the end of training. Pass the ruck march and you were almost guaranteed to graduate. Fail it and everything you had endured for the past 7 weeks meant nothing. Not of the distance. She had been running her whole life, but of the weight. 35 pounds on her back, plus the baby inside her, plus the constant drain on her energy. She was now around 16 weeks pregnant. Her belly had a noticeable curve to it that she hid under her loose uniform top and the heavy rucksack, but the weight was becoming harder to manage. Her back ached constantly. Her hips were shifting. Her center of gravity was changing in ways that made her feel unsteady, and the thought of marching 12 miles with all of that weight pressing down on her body made her stomach clench with fear. The night before the ruck march, she could not sleep. She lay in her bunk with her hands on her stomach and she talked to the baby. She told it about her father, about the marches he used to describe when he came home on leave, about the weight of his rucksack and the sand in his boots and the sun on his back. She told the baby that tomorrow was the most important day of their life together, that if they could get through this one day, everything would be different. She asked the baby to be strong, to hold on, to trust her. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet, desperate prayer, she fell asleep. The ruck march started at 0500 hours in the cold grey light before dawn. The platoon assembled in full gear at the starting point, a gravel road that wound through the wooded hills around the base. Sergeant Rowan stood at the front and gave his briefing. 12 miles, 3 hours. No stops, no excuses. Anyone who fell out would be recycled. Anyone who quit would be discharged. He looked at each of them as he spoke, and when his eyes reached Maria, they lingered for an extra second, not with malice, not with contempt, with something else. Something that looked almost like a warning. They started walking. The pace was fast, not running, but not casual walking either. Aggressive military pace that covered ground quickly and punished anyone who could not keep up. The rucksack dug into Maria's shoulders immediately. The straps cut into her flesh through the uniform. The weight pressed down on her spine and radiated through her hips and legs. Within the first mile, she could feel the baby shifting inside her, adjusting to the movement, the rhythm of her steps like a drummer keeping time. By mile 3, the platoon had started to spread out. The strongest recruits were at the front, keeping pace with Sergeant Rowan's long strides. The weakest were falling behind, their faces red and their breathing ragged. Maria was somewhere in the middle, not leading, not lagging, just moving, one foot in front of the other, step after step after step. She had developed a technique during training where she would count her steps in groups of 100. It broke the distance into small, manageable pieces. 100 steps, then another 100, then another. It kept her mind focused and kept the panic from creeping in. By mile 5, the pain started. Real pain. Not the dull ache of tired muscles, but a sharp, stabbing pain in her lower back that shot down through her left hip with every step. Maria recognized it immediately. Round ligament pain, something she had read about in a pregnancy book she had secretly ordered and hidden under her mattress. It happened when the ligaments supporting the uterus stretched as the baby grew. It was normal. It was not dangerous, but it was excruciating. Like someone was driving a hot needle into her hip with every step she took. She gritted her teeth and kept walking. She adjusted her rucksack higher on her back to shift some of the weight off her hips. She shortened her stride. She focused on her breathing. In through the nose for 4 counts. Out through the mouth for 4 counts. The same breathing pattern her father had described using during his marches. She heard his voice in her head like a ghost walking beside her. 1 more step. 1 more mile. You do not quit. You never quit. Mile 7 was where the route went uphill, a long, steady incline through thick woods that seemed to go on forever. The gravel road turned to dirt, and the dirt was loose and slippery from recent rain. Several recruits lost their footing and stumbled. One recruit, a large man from Ohio, went down hard and had to be helped up by 2 others. Maria kept her head down and her eyes on the ground in front of her, and she climbed. The pain in her back was constant now, a hot throbbing presence that colored everything with a red haze. Her legs were shaking, her lungs were burning, and the baby was moving. Not the gentle flutter she had felt before. This was stronger, more insistent. Like the child was trying to tell her something. She talked to the baby as she walked, under her breath so no one could hear. She told it they were almost there. She told it to hang on. She told it that its mother was strong, and that it would be strong too. She told it about the life they would have together, about the things she would teach it, about the world she would show it. And with every word, she felt a tiny kick against her belly, like the baby was saying, yes, keep going. We can do this. At mile 9, something happened that almost ended everything. The route crossed a shallow creek that had been swollen by the recent rains. The water was knee-deep and moving fast, and the rocks on the bottom were slick with algae. Sergeant Rowan crossed first, his long legs making it look easy. The recruits followed one by one, some of them slipping and catching themselves, others wading through with their rucksacks held above their heads. Maria reached the creek and stepped in. The cold water hit her legs like a shock. She gasped. Her foot found a rock and she pushed forward another step. The water was at her knees now, pushing against her, trying to knock her off balance. She was halfway across when her boots slipped on an algae-covered rock and she went down. Not all the way down. She caught herself on one knee, but the rucksack shifted hard to one side and the weight of it pulled her sideways. And for one horrible second, she was going under. The water was at her chest. Her hand found a rock on the bottom and she pushed herself up, and she stood there in the middle of the creek with water streaming off her and her rucksack dripping and her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Braddock was behind her on the bank. He was laughing, not trying to hide it anymore, just standing there with his arms crossed and his rucksack on his back, laughing at her like she was a joke, like she was entertainment. And several of the other men were laughing too. Not all of them, but enough. Sergeant Rowan was on the other side of the creek. He had turned around and he was watching. His face was unreadable. He did not help her. He did not tell anyone else to help her. He just watched. Maria pulled herself out of the creek on the far bank. She was soaking wet. Her uniform was heavy with water. Her rucksack felt like it had doubled in weight. She was shivering. The pain in her back was screaming. And the baby was moving rapidly, responding to the cold water and the rush of adrenaline. But she was on her feet. She was still moving, and she was not going to stop. The last 3 miles were the longest of her life. Every step was agony. Her wet uniform chafed against her skin. Her boots squelched with every footfall. The rucksack straps had rubbed her shoulders raw, and she could feel warm blood mixing with the cold water that dripped down her back. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, step after step, count after count. 100 steps, then another 100, then another. She passed 2 recruits who had fallen out. They were sitting on the side of the road with their heads between their knees. Done. Finished. She passed another recruit who was limping badly, his face twisted in pain. She did not stop. She could not stop. If she stopped, she might not start again. The finish line was a simple white marker on the side of the road. Nothing special, just a painted rock. But to Maria, it looked like the gates of heaven. She crossed it at 2 hours and 47 minutes. 13 minutes under the time limit. She was not the first to finish. She was not the last. She was somewhere in the middle. But she had finished. She had carried her rucksack and her weapon and her equipment and her unborn child across 12 miles of rough terrain, and she had not quit. She had not fallen out. She had not asked for help. When she crossed the line, she stopped walking, and she bent over with her hands on her knees and she breathed. Deep, ragged breaths that tore at her lungs and made her whole body shake. And then she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Tears. They came without warning, rolling down her muddy face and dripping off her chin onto the gravel below. She was crying, not because she was sad, Not because she was hurt, because she was proud. Because she had done something that no one believed she could do. Because she had carried 2 lives across those 12 miles and both of them had survived. She wiped her face quickly before anyone could see. She straightened up and adjusted her rucksack and walked to the assembly area where the other recruits were gathering. And that was when she saw Braddock. He was standing at the edge of the group and his face was red and he was breathing hard and he was looking at her. But he was not laughing this time because Maria had beaten him. She had crossed the finish line 3 minutes before he did. The days after the Ruck March should have been the beginning of the end. Training was winding down. Graduation was approaching. The recruits who had survived the past 8 weeks were tired but confident. They had been broken down and built back up, and they could feel the finish line approaching like a warm light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. But for Maria, the days after the Ruck March were the beginning of a crisis. Her body was rebelling. The Ruck March had pushed her to a physical limit that her pregnant body could not sustain. She was cramping. Not severely, but enough to scare her. Enough to keep her up at night with her hands pressed against her belly, praying to every god she could think of that the baby was okay. She was dizzy all the time now. The fatigue was crushing, and she had started to show in a way that no amount of loose uniform could completely hide. Tanya Wilkins was the first to figure it out. She came to Maria's bunk one night after lights out, and she sat down on the edge of the mattress and she whispered 4 words that stopped Maria's heart. "I know you are pregnant." Maria did not deny it. She was too tired to deny it, too scared, too lonely. She looked at Tanya in the dark, and she nodded, and then she told her everything. About the test before she shipped out, about the decision to come anyway, about the morning sickness and the pain and the fear, about the baby she was carrying that she already loved more than anything in the world, and about the terrible, impossible choice she faced: tell the truth and lose everything she had worked for, or keep the secret and risk the life of her child. Tanya listened to everything without interrupting, and when Maria was done, Tanya took her hand and squeezed it and said something that Maria would never forget. She said, "You are the bravest person I have ever met, and also the most stubborn." And then she said that Maria needed to see a doctor, that the cramping and the dizziness were warning signs, that the baby needed medical attention, that no career, no uniform, no promise to a dead father was worth risking the life of an innocent child. Maria knew she was right. She had known for weeks, but hearing it from someone else, hearing it spoken out loud in the dark, quiet barracks, made it real in a way she could no longer avoid. She had to tell someone. She had to come clean. And that meant going to the one person she feared most, Sergeant First Class Dale Rowan. She decided to do it the next morning. She would request a private meeting. She would tell him the truth. She would accept whatever consequences came. And she would pray that somewhere in that stone face and those cold eyes, there was a shred of something human. Something that could understand what she had done and why she had done it. Something that could see past the broken rules and the deception and the disobedience and see the woman underneath, the mother underneath, the soldier underneath. That night she lay in her bunk and she whispered to her baby one last time. She told it that tomorrow everything was going to change. She told it that she did not know what would happen. She told it that she was scared. But she also told it that no matter what happened, no matter what Sergeant Rowan said or did, no matter what the army decided, she would never regret this. She would never regret choosing to fight. She would never regret proving that she was strong enough to stand in the fire and not burn. And she would never, ever regret choosing the baby, because the baby was the best thing she had ever done. Better than any obstacle course, better than any rifle score, better than any ruck march. The baby kicked against her hand, hard and strong and certain. And Maria smiled in the dark and closed her eyes and waited for the morning. The morning came too fast. Maria opened her eyes and the barracks was still dark and the only sound was the low hum of the heating unit in the corner and the steady breathing of the other recruits sleeping around her. For a long moment she did not move. She just lay there with her hands on her belly and felt the warmth of the baby inside her, and she tried to memorize the feeling of being a soldier and a mother at the same time. The feeling of being 2 things the world told her she could not be. Because after today, one of those things might be taken away from her forever. She got up slowly. Her body protested. Everything hurt. The cramping from the night before had faded to a dull ache in her lower abdomen, but it was still there. A reminder, a warning. She dressed quietly and stepped outside into the cold morning air. But she did not go to the pull-up bar. Not today. Today she stood in the dark and looked up at the sky and she breathed. Just breathed. And she let herself feel everything she had been holding back for the past 8 weeks. The fear, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the love for the tiny life inside her, the grief for her father, the anger at the world for making this so hard. She let it all wash through her like a wave, and then she let it go. And when it was gone, she felt lighter, not happy, but lighter. Like she had set down a rucksack she had been carrying for years. After breakfast, she approached Sergeant Rowan. He was standing outside the barracks reviewing a clipboard, his uniform pressed sharp and his boots polished to a mirror shine. Maria walked up to him and stood at attention, and she requested a private meeting. Sergeant Rowan looked at her over the top of his clipboard. His eyes narrowed. He asked her what it was about. She said it was personal. He stared at her for what felt like a full minute. Then he told her to follow him. They walked to his office, a small room at the end of the barracks building with a metal desk and 2 chairs and a flag in the corner. The walls were bare except for a few photographs of Sergeant Rowan's previous platoons, rows of young faces staring out from behind glass. Some of them were probably out in the world now, serving overseas, raising families, living the lives that basic training had prepared them for. And some of them, Maria thought, might not have made it at all. Sergeant Rowan sat behind his desk and folded his hands and told Maria to speak. His voice was not hostile, but it was not warm either. It was the voice of a man who had heard every excuse, every sob story, every desperate plea in the book. A man who had built walls around himself so thick that nothing could get through. Maria stood at attention on the other side of the desk, and she looked at the wall above his head because she could not look at his eyes. And then she told him. She said, "Sergeant, I need to tell you something." She said, "I should have told you before I got here, but I was afraid." She said, "I know what I did was wrong, and I know there will be consequences, and I am prepared to accept them." And then she took a breath, and she said the words that she had been holding inside her like a bomb for 8 weeks. She said, "Sergeant, I am pregnant." The room went completely silent. The kind of silence that has weight to it. The kind that presses against your ears and makes the air feel thick. Sergeant Rowan did not move. He did not blink. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded, and he stared at her, and she could not read his expression because his expression was nothing. It was blank. It was stone. It was the same face he always wore, but somehow different, somehow deeper. He asked her how far along she was. She told him approximately 16 weeks. He asked her if she had seen a doctor. She said no. He asked her if she was experiencing any complications. She told him about the cramping and the dizziness. He asked her why she had not disclosed her pregnancy before reporting to basic training. She said because she knew they would not let her come. He asked her why it was so important for her to come. And Maria told him. She told him about her father, about the promise she had made at his grave, about the fire that burned inside her that would not go out, about the life she wanted to build for herself and for her child, a life of service and strength and purpose, a life that meant something. Sergeant Rowan listened to everything without interrupting. When she was done, he sat there for a long time, long enough that Maria started to think he was not going to say anything at all, long enough that the silence became almost unbearable. And then he did something that Maria had never seen him do. He sighed, a deep, heavy sigh that seemed to come from somewhere far below his surface, from a place he kept hidden from everyone. He told her to sit down. She sat in the chair across from his desk and she folded her hands in her lap and she waited. He said, "You have been training for 8 weeks with a baby inside you." He said you completed every physical assessment, every drill, every exercise, the ruck march, the obstacle course, all of it while pregnant. He said it as a statement, not a question, like he was laying the facts out in front of himself and trying to understand them. Maria said, "Yes, Sergeant." He shook his head slowly, not in anger, in something else. She could not tell what. And then he said something that cracked the stone in his voice for just a moment. He said your father would have been proud of you. Maria felt the tears come. She could not stop them this time. They spilled down her cheeks and dripped off her jaw, and she did not wipe them away because she did not care anymore. She had spent 8 weeks pretending to be made of iron, and she was tired. So tired. And hearing those words from this man who had never given her an ounce of softness broke something open inside her that she had kept locked tight since the day her father died. Sergeant Rowan let her cry. He did not tell her to stop. He did not look away. He just sat there, and he waited. And when she was done, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a box of tissues and set them on the edge of the desk, and he waited for her to compose herself. Then he got down to business. He told her that what she had done was dangerous, not just to herself, but to the baby. He told her that there were protocols and regulations and medical standards that existed for a reason. He told her that the army was not in the business of putting unborn children at risk, and he told her that she should have told someone the truth from the very beginning. Maria nodded. She knew all of this. She had known it from the moment she walked through the gates of Fort Leonard Wood. But then Sergeant Rowan said something she did not expect. He said that what she had done was also one of the most extraordinary things he had ever witnessed in his 20 years of military service. He said that he had trained thousands of recruits and he had seen tough men break down in tears during the Ruck March. He had seen athletes and football players and wrestlers who could not handle the mental pressure of basic training. He had seen recruits with every advantage in the world quit because they did not have the will to continue. And here was this small, quiet woman from a border town in Texas who had completed every single requirement of basic training while secretly carrying a child inside her, while dealing with morning sickness and back pain and cramping and fear and the constant threat of being discovered, while enduring the mockery and harassment of her peers, while carrying a weight that no one else in the platoon could even imagine. He said he did not know whether to be furious with her or to recommend her for a commendation. Maria almost laughed. Almost. But the situation was too serious for laughter. Sergeant Rowan told her that she needed to see a doctor immediately. He said he would arrange for medical transport to the base hospital that morning. He said that the baby's health was now the priority, and everything else was secondary. He said that depending on what the doctors said, her future in the army would be determined by people above his pay grade. Then he asked her one more question. He asked her what she wanted, not what the army wanted, not what her father would have wanted, what she wanted. Maria thought about it, really thought about it. For the first time in 8 weeks, she stopped thinking about duty and promises and proving herself, and she just thought about what she wanted. And the answer was simpler than she expected. She said she wanted both. She wanted the army, and she wanted the baby. She wanted to serve her country, and she wanted to be a mother. She wanted to be the kind of woman who did not have to choose between being strong and being soft, between being a warrior and being a nurturer. She wanted to prove that those things were not opposites, that they were the same thing seen from different angles. Sergeant Rowan looked at her for a long time, and then he nodded. Just once. A single sharp nod that said more than 1,000 words could have said. He stood up and he told her to wait in the office. Then he left. She heard his boots echoing down the hallway, and then she heard him pick up a phone and start making calls. She could not hear what he was saying, but she could hear the tone of his voice. It was different from his training voice, quieter, more deliberate, like he was choosing every word carefully. He was gone for almost an hour. Maria sat in the chair and she waited, and she put her hands on her belly and she talked to the baby. She told it that they had done it, that the secret was out, that whatever happened next, they were going to face it together. The baby kicked, hard and strong, and Maria smiled through her tears. When Sergeant Rowan came back, he was not alone. There was a woman with him, a major in a medical uniform with grey hair pulled back in a tight bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She introduced herself as Major Patricia Webb, the base's chief medical officer. She asked Maria to come with her. The examination at the base hospital took 2 hours. They did blood work, an ultrasound, a physical exam. Major Webb was thorough and gentle and professional. She asked Maria questions about her pregnancy history and her symptoms and her nutrition, and Maria answered everything honestly for the first time in 8 weeks. No more lies. No more hiding. Just the truth. The ultrasound was the moment that changed everything. Major Webb spread the cold gel on Maria's belly and pressed the wand against her skin, and the screen came alive with grey shadows and white lines. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, was a shape, a tiny human shape with a round head and small arms, and legs that kicked and moved and tumbled in the dark, warm space inside her. Major Webb pointed to the screen and said, "Do you see that?" Maria nodded. She could not speak, because on the screen, in black and white, she could see her baby's heart beating, a tiny flicker of light pulsing with life, steady and strong and unstoppable. Like a drum, like a march, like the heartbeat of a soldier. Major Webb told her the baby was healthy, remarkably healthy considering what Maria had put her body through. There were no signs of distress, no complications. The cramping had been caused by dehydration and overexertion, but it had not affected the baby. Major Webb said that Maria was extremely lucky. She also said that she was extremely foolish, and then she smiled and said that sometimes being lucky and being foolish went hand in hand. The next 24 hours were a blur. Sergeant Rowan reported the situation to the battalion commander. The battalion commander reported it to the brigade commander. Phone calls were made. Regulations were consulted. Meetings were held behind closed doors that Maria was not invited to. She spent the day in the medical barracks under Major Webb's observation, lying on a clean bed with actual pillows and sheets that did not smell like sweat and gun oil, and she waited. The word spread through the platoon like wildfire. By lunchtime, every recruit in the company knew that Maria Vasquez had been training while pregnant. The reactions were mixed. Some of the recruits were shocked. Some were impressed. Some were angry that she had been allowed to continue for so long. And some, the ones who had been with her from the beginning, the ones who had watched her fall and get back up and fall again and get back up again, they were something else entirely. They were inspired. Tanya Wilkins came to visit her in the medical barracks that afternoon. She brought a candy bar from the PX and she sat on the edge of the bed and she told Maria what was happening in the platoon. She said that Braddock had gone quiet, completely quiet. For the first time in 8 weeks, the loudest mouth in the platoon had nothing to say. She said that some of the men who had laughed at Maria were looking at the ground now when her name came up. She said that Sergeant Rowan had addressed the platoon after morning formation, and he had said something that nobody expected. He had told them that he owed them an apology, that he had spent 8 weeks pushing a recruit harder than he should have because he had made assumptions about her based on her size and her gender. He said that recruit Vasquez had shown more courage, more determination, and more strength than any recruit he had ever trained. And then he said that he was putting her name forward for graduation. That she had earned it, that the army needed soldiers like her. Maria listened to Tanya tell this story, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not pride, not relief, something quieter than both, something like peace. Like she had been running for years, and she had finally stopped and looked around, and realized that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The battalion commander's decision came down the next day. Maria would be allowed to graduate with her platoon. She would receive a modified duty assignment after graduation that would accommodate her pregnancy. She would be required to complete her remaining training requirements after the baby was born. It was not standard protocol. It was not by the book. But the battalion commander, a colonel with 30 years of service and 3 daughters of his own, had made a judgment call. He had looked at Maria's training record and her qualification scores and her physical assessment results, and he had decided that bending the rules was worth it because soldiers like Maria Vasquez did not come along very often. Graduation day was a clear, cold morning in March. The platoon assembled on the parade ground in their dress uniforms. 42 recruits had started training in January. 31 were graduating. 11 had washed out along the way, dropped for physical failure or disciplinary issues or simply because they could not handle the pressure. But 31 remained. And among them, standing in the second row with her uniform pressed and her boots polished and her chin held high, was Maria Vasquez. She was showing now. There was no hiding it anymore. Under her dress uniform, her belly was round and firm and unmistakable. And she did not care. She did not try to hide it. For the first time in her military career, she stood with both of her identities fully visible. Soldier and mother, warrior and nurturer. Both at once, both at the same time. The ceremony was simple. Speeches from the battalion commander and the company commander, a flag presentation, the playing of the army song, and then the moment that every recruit had been waiting for, the turning of the berets, the moment when they officially became soldiers. When Maria turned her beret, she felt the baby kick. One strong, solid kick against her ribs that made her gasp. And she put her hand on her belly, and she looked up at the sky, and she whispered, "Thank you, Daddy." 'Cause somewhere up there she knew her father was watching. Somewhere up there she knew he was standing at attention, and saluting, and smiling with tears running down his face, because his daughter had done it. She had finished what he started. She had worn the uniform. She had earned the title, and she had done it while carrying the next generation inside her. After the ceremony, the families gathered on the parade ground. There were hugs and photographs and tears and laughter. Maria's mother was there. She had driven 14 hours from Texas with Diego in the back seat to watch her daughter graduate. When she saw Maria walk toward her in that uniform, with that belly, she covered her mouth with her hands, and she started crying. Not sad crying, happy crying. The kind of crying that sounds like laughter. And she held Maria so tight that Maria thought she might never let go. Diego, who was now 6 years old, looked up at his sister and he said, "You look like Daddy." Maria knelt down and she hugged her little brother and she said that was the nicest thing anyone had ever said to her. Sergeant Rowan found her after the ceremony. He walked up to her and her family and he stood there for a moment, looking slightly uncomfortable in a way that Maria had never seen before. He was always so controlled, so composed. But standing in front of this small woman and her family, he seemed almost uncertain, like he did not know what to say. He said, "Congratulations, soldier." And then he did something that shocked everyone who saw it. He extended his hand, not to shake hers, to give her something. He opened his palm, and in it was a small coin, a challenge coin. The kind that military units give to soldiers who demonstrate exceptional service. It was bronze and heavy, and on one side it had the insignia of the training battalion, and on the other side it had 4 words engraved in block letters, STNG, beyond measure. Maria took the coin and held it in her hand and felt the weight of it. The weight of everything it represented. The pull-ups in the dark, the obstacle course in the mud, the ruck march in the rain, the creek crossing, the rifle range, the morning sickness, the cramping, the fear, the loneliness, the secret, all of it compressed into this small, heavy piece of metal that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She looked up at Sergeant Rowan and she said, "Thank you, Sergeant." And he looked back at her and his stone face cracked. Just a little, just enough for her to see the man behind the uniform. The man who had spent 20 years building walls around his heart and who had just felt one of those walls come down. He nodded, he turned, and he walked away. Maria Vasquez went on to have a healthy baby girl 3 months after graduation. She named her Elena Rowan Vasquez. The middle name was not a coincidence. She returned to active duty 6 months after giving birth. She completed her advanced training at the top of her class. She qualified as an expert marksman. She deployed overseas twice. She was promoted 3 times in 4 years. And everywhere she went, she carried 2 things with her: the challenge coin that Sergeant Rowan had given her, and a photograph of her father in his uniform, smiling at the camera with the same old eyes that Maria had inherited, the eyes that had seen things before they happened. The eyes that carried weight. Braddock completed basic training but was discharged 6 months later for disciplinary issues. Maria heard about it through the military grapevine and she felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not pity. Nothing. He was simply irrelevant. A footnote in a story that was never about him. Sergeant Rowan retired from the Army 2 years after Maria's graduation. At his retirement ceremony, he gave a speech about the thousands of recruits he had trained over his career. He talked about the ones who were the strongest and the fastest and the toughest. But at the end of his speech, he talked about one recruit who was none of those things. A recruit who was small and quiet and underestimated. A recruit who carried a secret so heavy that it should have crushed her. A recruit who showed him that strength had nothing to do with size or speed or muscle, that real strength was something deeper, something that could not be measured by a stopwatch or a scale, something that lived in the heart and the soul and the stubborn refusal to give up, even when every rational voice in your head was screaming at you to quit. He did not say Maria's name. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. Years later, Maria was stationed at Fort Bragg when she received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten on plain white paper. The handwriting was precise and neat and military in its discipline. It was from Sergeant Rowan. It was short, just a few lines. It said that he had been watching her career from a distance, that he had seen her promotions and her deployments and her commendations. that he was not surprised by any of it. And then at the bottom of the letter he had written something that Maria read over and over until the paper was soft from her fingers. He wrote that the day she walked into his office and told him the truth was the day he realized that he had been wrong about a lot of things, that he had spent 20 years measuring soldiers by their bodies when he should have been measuring them by their hearts, that she had taught him more in 8 weeks than the army had taught him in 20 years, and that if his own daughter ever grew up to be half the woman Maria was, he would consider himself the luckiest father in the world. Maria folded the letter and put it in the box where she kept her challenge coin and her father's photograph. 3 objects. 3 pieces of a story that she would one day tell Elena. The story of a woman who walked into a world that was not built for her and refused to leave until it changed. The story of a sergeant who thought he knew everything and learned that the strongest soldier he ever trained was the one he almost dismissed. The story of a baby who was carried through mud and water and fire and came out on the other side healthy and strong and loved beyond measure. Elena is 12 years old now. She has her mother's old eyes and her grandfather's stubborn jaw, and she asks a lot of questions about both of them. Maria answers every question honestly. She tells Elena about the good things and the hard things, about the pride and the pain, about the moments of triumph and the moments of doubt. And when Elena asks her mother what the hardest thing she ever did was, Maria always gives the same answer. She says the hardest thing was not the obstacle course or the ruck march or the rifle range. The hardest thing was not keeping the secret or enduring the mockery or facing Sergeant Rowan. The hardest thing was standing at her father's grave at 9 years old and deciding not to cry, because that was the moment she learned what strength really was. Not the absence of pain, not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going anyway. The decision to carry the weight. The decision to climb the wall. The decision to cross the creek. The decision to show up every morning in the dark and do one more pull-up, even when your arms are shaking and your hands are bleeding and the world is telling you to stop. That is what she tells her daughter. And that is what Elena will one day tell her children. And the story will pass from mother to daughter to granddaughter like a challenge coin, heavy and real and impossible to forget. A story about a woman who was told she did not belong, a woman who was laughed at and pushed down and dismissed, a woman who showed up anyway, who kept going anyway, who carried the weight anyway, and who changed everything. Not with her fists, not with her voice, not with anger or revenge or vindication, but with something much more powerful, with the quiet, stubborn, unbreakable strength of a heart that refused to quit,